Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to ancient Rome to spend an evening inside a building most people picture as marble columns, dramatic speeches, and men in togas shouting about the fate of civilization. But before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you ask most people what a Roman senator's life looked like, they'll describe something cinematic. Grand debates, sweeping rhetoric, a man rising dramatically to deliver a speech that changes the course of history while the entire chamber falls silent. It's a wonderful image. It is also, for the overwhelming majority of senators on most ordinary days, almost entirely wrong. The truth is quieter and, honestly, a great deal more familiar. Being a Roman senator meant meetings that started too early. It meant committees, subcommittees, and endless procedural rules about who was allowed to speak and in what order. It meant currying favor with people you didn't particularly like, attending events you didn't particularly want to attend, and spending an enormous amount of energy managing your reputation among colleagues who were quietly doing the exact same thing to you. In other words, if you swapped the togas for suits in the Senate House for a glass office tower, you would recognize the rhythm immediately. Rome's senators weren't gladiators of rhetoric locked in constant dramatic combat. Most of the time, they were something far more relatable. Middle management with better sandals. Tonight, we're going to walk through an ordinary day and an ordinary career in the life of a Roman senator. And by the end, you may find yourself feeling a strange and unexpected kinship with men who died 2,000 years ago, mostly because they complain about many of the same things you do. Let's start with how you even got the job, because unlike a modern promotion, nobody handed a Roman senator an offer letter. Membership in the Senate wasn't advertised, applied for, or interviewed. It was earned, almost always, by climbing a very specific and very rigid ladder called the cursus honorum, or the course of honors. Think of it less like a job posting and more like an extremely slow, extremely expensive corporate ladder with mandatory tenure at every rung. A young Roman with ambition didn't simply walk into the Senate House one morning and ask for a seat. He first had to serve in the military, usually for several years, proving himself capable of leadership before anyone would trust him with a debate. Then came the quaestorship, an entry-level financial post that involved a great deal of bookkeeping, tax collection, and paperwork nobody particularly enjoyed. It was, in many ways, the ancient equivalent of your first job out of university, the one where you technically have a title but mostly spend your day making sure someone else's numbers add up correctly. Serve as quaestor successfully, and congratulations, you were automatically enrolled in the Senate. You had, in modern terms, been onboarded. But being enrolled and being influential were two very different things. A new senator sat quietly near the back, rarely asked to speak, mostly there to observe how the real business of governing actually worked. Imagine attending your first executive meeting, saying absolutely nothing, and mostly try to remember everyone's name while nodding thoughtfully at things you didn't fully understand yet. That was the reality for a junior member of the Senate. Nobody handed you the good assignments on day one. From there, the ladder continued. Aedile, praetor, consul, each rung more prestigious, more expensive, and more competitive than the last. Candidates spent staggering sums of money on public games, feasts, and favors simply to be noticed by voters. It was, essentially, an ancient version of campaign spending, except instead of television ads, you paid for chariot races and hoped the crowd remembered your generosity come election season. And here's the part that should sound uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has ever sat through a performance review. Advancement in the Senate depended heavily on visibility. It wasn't only about competence. It was about being seen as competent by the right people at the right moments. A brilliant administrator who never networked properly could watch a mediocre one climb straight past him, simply because the mediocre one had cultivated better relationships with senior senators. Some things, it seems, never change. Once you had actually secured your seat, and perhaps years or even decades had passed since your first day observing quietly from the back benches, your working life settled into a routine that modern office workers would find almost eerily familiar. The Senate didn't meet every single day. Meetings were scheduled around a religious calendar, certain days considered unlucky or inauspicious for public business. In other words, Rome had something resembling a fixed working week, interrupted regularly by what were essentially public holidays, except the holidays were determined by whether or not the sacred chickens had eaten their breakfast enthusiastically enough that morning. Yes, that was a genuine method Romans used to decide whether the omens favored important business. Imagine explaining to your manager today that the quarterly meeting has been postponed because the office hamster refused its lunch. On a normal meeting day, senators gathered before dawn. Punctuality mattered enormously, and arriving late to a session could quietly damage your reputation among colleagues who noticed everything. The presiding magistrate opened proceedings, usually a consul, and the order of speaking followed strict seniority. The most senior, most respected senators spoke first. Junior senators waited, and sometimes waited so long that by the time it was finally their turn, the actual decision had effectively already been made through hours of earlier debate. Their vote still counted, technically, but their influence over the outcome was roughly equivalent to speaking up in a meeting after everyone has already agreed to email about it later. Debates themselves could stretch for hours. There was no strict time limit on speeches, which meant a particularly stubborn senator could simply talk and talk and talk, deliberately running out the clock to delay a vote he opposed. This tactic even had a name, and modern legislatures around the world still use a version of it today. The Romans essentially invented the filibuster roughly 2,000 years before anyone thought to give it that name. If you have ever sat in a meeting that could have been an email, purely because one person refused to stop talking, congratulations, you have experienced authentic ancient Roman governance. Attendance itself was expected, but not always guaranteed. Senators occasionally sent word that they were unavailable, managing personal estates, recovering from illness, or conveniently absent when a particularly uncomfortable vote was scheduled. Sound familiar? Somewhere in the afterlife, a Roman senator is nodding approvingly at every employee who has ever scheduled a dentist appointment specifically to skip a meeting they didn't want to attend. Beyond the formal sessions, an enormous amount of senators' actual work happened in the hallways, the dinner parties, and the private conversations that historians politely call informal politics, and everyone else simply calls office gossip with higher stakes. Rome ran heavily on a system called patronage. Wealthy, powerful senators maintained networks of clients, ordinary citizens who depended on them for legal assistance, financial support, or political favors, and who in exchange offered loyalty, votes, and public displays of support. Every morning, a senator's house might fill with a crowd of clients arriving for what was called the salutatio, a formal greeting ritual where visitors paid respects to their patron, sometimes receiving a small gift of food or money in return. Picture, if you will, arriving at the office an hour early simply to stand in your boss's doorway and say good morning, hoping he remembers your name when promotion season arrives. The Romans did this daily and considered it a perfectly normal part of maintaining a career. Dinner parties served a similar function, though with considerably better wine. Alliances were formed over multiple courses of food. Deals were quietly negotiated between the main course and dessert, and reputations could rise or fall based entirely on who sat near whom at a wealthy senator's table. Nothing on the official Senate calendar technically required attendance at these dinners. Everything about your career quietly depended on it anyway. If that sounds exactly like being expected to show up at the optional after-work drinks your entire team is attending, you are beginning to understand Roman political life rather well. Correspondence mattered too. Senators wrote constantly, to allies in provinces, to former colleagues no longer in Rome, to family members managing distant estates. Letters took days or weeks to arrive, which meant careful, deliberate written communication became an essential skill. In some ways, it was rather like managing an inbox that occasionally took a month to receive a reply, and where sending the wrong tone in an important letter could unravel a friendship that had taken years to build. Then there was the paperwork in Rome. Somewhat surprisingly to those who imagine only togas and speeches, absolutely drowned in paperwork. Provincial governors, many of them former senators, sent detailed reports back to Rome. Tax records needed reviewing. Treaties required careful, precise legal language. Building projects, grain distributions, military supply lines, court cases religious calendars, all of it eventually crossed the senator's desk in one form or another, usually written on wax tablets or papyrus scrolls by an army of scribes and secretaries working quietly in the background. A wealthy senator often employed several educated slaves specifically trained in shorthand and record-keeping, essentially running what amounted to a small private office, complete with its own administrative staff handling correspondence, scheduling, and documentation. If a modern executive assistant ever complained about managing an overflowing calendar, they might take some comfort knowing the concept is at least 2,000 years old. Committees existed as well, smaller groups appointed to investigate specific issues before reporting back to the full Senate. Some committees dealt with foreign treaties. Others reviewed religious matters, public instruction, or complaints from provincial cities. Serving on one of these committees could be either a genuine honor, a chance to demonstrate competence to senior colleagues, or an absolute chore nobody particularly wanted, depending entirely on the subject matter and who else had been assigned alongside you. Some things about committee work, it turns out, are simply universal constants of human civilization. Of course, no corporate comparison would be complete without office politics, and Rome had office politics on an almost operatic scale. Factions formed around powerful families and their allies, shifting alliances that could completely rearrange the balance of Senate within a single election cycle. A senator's career could be quietly sabotaged by a rival spreading unflattering rumors or elevated overnight by an unexpected alliance with a rising political star. Reputation was currency, and it could be spent invested or catastrophically lost within a single well-timed speech. Ambitious senators cultivated what Romans called dignitas, a combination of reputation, honor, and public standing that mattered enormously to how seriously colleagues took you. Losing dignitas through a public embarrassment, a failed prosecution, or an unpopular political stance could quietly end a career that had taken decades to build. Imagine spending 20 years working your way up a company, only to have your reputation permanently damaged by a single poorly worded email accidentally sent to the entire office instead of one colleague. The stakes for a Roman senator were somewhat higher than an awkward reply all, but the underlying anxiety would have felt entirely familiar. And through it all, senators had to appear composed, dignified, and entirely unbothered by any of it, regardless of how much genuine stress simmered beneath the surface. Public displays of panic, desperation, or excessive ambition were considered deeply unbecoming. The ideal senator projected calm authority at all times, even while quietly maneuvering behind the scenes with the same anxious energy as anyone frantically checking their inbox before an important client call. So the next time someone imagines ancient Rome as an endless parade of dramatic speeches and marble grandeur, remember the quieter truth. Behind the impressive architecture and the famous rhetoric stood thousands of ordinary working days. Early mornings, long, occasionally pointless meetings, committees nobody particularly wanted to join, correspondence that took far too long to receive replies, office politics conducted over dinner instead of coffee, and careers built patiently, year after year, through visibility, relationships, and a great deal of quiet, unglamorous administrative labor. The senators debating the fate of the republic were, in their own way, simply going to work. And perhaps that's the most human detail of all. 2,000 years of history, and somewhere underneath the togas, the marble, and the legendary speeches, someone was still complaining about a meeting that could have been an email. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next one.